Get Geeked, presented by Barnes and Noble. I'm here today with Randy Ribay, who is the author of The Reckoning of Roku, right here, as well as a few other books which we will talk to. And Randy, I want to start with well, first off, thank you for being here. How are you doing
Oh,
today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So let's start by just talking about the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. What was it about this world that drew you in the first place?
Yeah, so Avatar was one of those things that I got into pretty late. Like I didn't get into it until 2020 when it dropped on Netflix, during the start of the pandemic. But it was one of those things that like I had always heard like people recommending, right, over and over again because I'm kind of like in a lot of different fandoms as well, but Avatar I had not worked my way to around to. And so it was like on my list of like things to check out eventually, and then yeah, and then when it dropped on Netflix, I was like, all right, yeah, I can do this now. And yeah, and I was all in from episode one. I think like as a writer, I think one of the most difficult things to do is take a complex idea and make it simple and digestible, right? And I think to me, that's what Avatar does really well, right? Even from episode one, like essentially you have these like goofy kids going on this quest, but like at the heart of it, it's a story about the trauma of war on children, right? Like how war impacts children and children trying to heal from that. And so that got me, right? Because I'm always a fan of these like heavy themes that can be packaged in a way that's like really simple and really interesting and compelling. But then, of course, you know, like a lot of people, like the show is one of those things that I think it does everything well, right?
Mm.
The characters are wonderful and fleshed out, and the dynamics between them are interesting and complex. The world is interesting and fun and exciting. The whole bending, of course, leads to these great fights. And yeah, it's just like it hits like everything, right? It hits
Hmm.
everything. And it does it like in the package of a kids show,
Hmm.
which, as a young adult author, writes for teenagers, like that always, I'm always drawn to kids shows that can hit these heavy topics and do everything really well. And yeah, and that thing that's, so from episode one, I was like all in. I started tweeting. I had like a long Twitter thread kind of as I watched each episode and kind of reacting to each episode, which is actually like how they ended up like finding me and reaching out to me later. They were like, oh, we know you're a huge Avatar fan from that Twitter thread.
A lot you said there I want to get back to. I'm glad that you're a late Avatar bloomer too. I was also. I never watched it as a kid, and I think it was around the same time my wife was like, she just put it on, and I was like, "What is this?" And she's like, "You've never seen Avatar: The Last Airbender?" And I was like, "No." And then we watched it, and now it's like the background all the time. It's just
Mm,
constantly on in the house. But yeah, you mentioned something that I think is the way I always explain Avatar to people is usually in just one word: simple. They fit so much into a very simple and accessible story.
mhm.
And I think that's just a remarkable feat of storytelling. But I wanted to ask you too, you mentioned like the characters that you were drawn into. And I do think that this is a show and all of the sort of spin-offs of the show that does characters so well. Were there particular characters you were drawn to in your initial viewing?
I mean, like pretty like obvious answers, I feel like, but of course, Aang right
Sure.
away. I remember like, yeah, before I watched Avatar, I did one of those like internet, like personality tests, and it like claimed to be like the most scientific one, and had this huge database of fictional characters, and then at the end of it, it tells you like which characters you're most like, right? And my number one when I took it was Aang, and I had no idea who Aang was at the time. And I started watching, like, but I remember that always. And then when I started watching the show, I'm like, oh yeah, I feel Aang. So Aang, of course, Zuko,
Mm,
love a good redemption arc.
yeah.
And of course, Iroh too. Iroh is a fan favorite, and for good reason, I think.
Hmm.
Just this dude who just spouts wisdom, but is also goofy and lighthearted and drinks tea all the time. Uh, yeah, I think those were the characters that probably stood out to me the most, upon my initial watching.
I feel like telling somebody you're such an Aang is like the best compliment you can give them because he's like the most chill, good person out there. So congratulations on being an Aang. I feel like
Thank
that's
you,
quite the
thank you. Or at
accomplishment.
least I think, it's a personality test, so it's like it's I view myself as an Aang, I guess, more so than am I an Aang? I don't
That still
know.
counts.
Yeah.
So Yeah, the question that I have to ask everybody is, I'm guessing that you're an airbender. Do you have an element that you feel like this is me?
Yeah, I think I think because of my association with Aang, I think like philosophically I am aligned more with airbenders. But I'm also, I was born in the Philippines, and to me, like the Philippines were always like part of the Fire Nation.
Mm.
So I feel like an affinity for fire as well as I feel like, philosophically, morally kind of closer to airbenders.
Well, I'm glad that you feel an affinity to fire because clearly it worked out for you. I'm
Yeah.
Earth. I think I'm an Earthbender. I think it's one of those
Okay.
things where like I have my days where I'm like, nah, I think I'm an Airbender today. But
Yeah.
most of the time it's Earth. All right, so let's talk about sort of. We'll still talk about Avatar itself, but I want to talk about writing into Avatar as well because this is such a big universe that's expanding, which is so exciting. I love all these
Mhm.
new spin-off stories that are coming out of it. So let's talk about your relationship with Roku and with Sozin too, because the Reckoning of Roku deals with both of them, and they have such a wonderful relationship that begins as a friendship and it gets more complicated, and it ends more or less pretty tragically with some, hopefulness in there. But did you have like an early association with Roku and Sozin that drew you to them, or what was your initial exploration of them like?
Yeah, so something that in my own writing kind of outside of Avatar that I've always kind of been interested in exploring is male friendships,
Mm,
right? Particularly during those adolescent or teenage formative years. And so I think watching the show for the first time and coming across the story of Roku, and then you get the Avatar and the Fire Lord episode, which is just so amazing, right? That it crams all this history and complexity into what 22, 23 minutes. That just completely got me.
mm,
I think thinking about the complexity of that relationship and kind of how it ended up where it did. That's kind of really what drew me into, I think, into Roku, right? Into Roku and Sozin, and so yeah, so when the opportunity came up, I was excited to dig into that and explore kind of what went on between the two of them.
hmm And was that sort of the nugget that sprouted this whole story? Because it is very steeped in their relationship together and everything kind of, I wouldn't say everything spirals around that, but a lot of it has to do with, I mean, I feel like that's sort of the justification for why Sozin's in it so much is to show that there is still this sort of long distance friendship going on as much as they can. I actually, one of the parts that really got me was when Roku gets this chest of letters and Sister Disha says, now don't look at any of them. And I was like, I was heartbroken for him. I'm like, but he's got friends. So yeah, so to go back to the actual question, was their friendship sort of the nugget that sprouted the story? Was that like more or less a starting point for the story, or was there another sort of entry point for it?
Yeah, so I think like uh when I knew I was writing Roku, I knew that his relationship with Sozin had to be like a central piece of the story, a central theme in the story, kind of like how it got to that point. Because from the show where it ends up,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of where they started, but you don't really know the in between, right? And so as a writer, like that's interesting to me is to explore that in between, what happened between A and B, right? Or A and Z rather. And and so yeah, that was definitely a starting point. I spent, before I started drafting the story or outlining the story, I spent a lot of time just thinking about who these characters were at that time of their life, thinking about kind of how they might have, what brought them together originally, what drew them so close, what drove them apart from each other, and drove them apart in such a way that it is almost like, yeah, I don't know, it's harder to explain, right? It's not like you get to the end of the Avatar and they hate each other, right? They're still very close. They're still very, you know, something still bonding them even up until that last moment. And so spent a lot of time just kind of thinking about each of those two characters before I plotted out a story. And then kind of once I thought I understood those characters pretty well, or at least from my perspective, then I could kind of think about, well, what's a situation that would kind of illustrate this, right? In kind of like a microcosm. What's a situation like we know the big picture, but what's like a little picture kind of thing, like the seed or the start of kind of the different directions that they went into in life.
I love that, and I was going to ask about that too. This sort of notion that with the Kyoshi stories, it was the same way of as readers, assuming that they've seen Avatar: Last Airbender, they know the final product, they know what it's
Hmm.
building up to, So it's almost like, and I wanted to see to hear your thoughts on what the difference is between sort of creating a character from scratch and creating a character when you know what the end product is. Do you have a different process for creating those two different kinds of characters?
Yeah, I mean in terms of creating them, like when the characters are created, like it's nice because a lot of the work has already been done, right? Because when you're doing it yourself, you got to do everything. You got to figure
Right.
out everything, and so it's nice that like a lot of that work has already been done. But then it's also a little bit more difficult because you're working within this framework that exists, right? And as much as I knew, for example, that Roku's story also had to be about Sozin, I was also a little penned in by the canonical statement that they hadn't seen each other in like all of these years during his training. So I had to figure out kind of how to work around that to still illustrate the closeness of the relationship and what went on between them. And so yeah, so that's a little bit difficult kind of working within that, but it's also kind of interesting. It makes it almost like a puzzle, right?
Mhm.
Almost like a trying to figure out like how can I do this, knowing where I want to end, knowing where it ends up, knowing kind of who I think these characters are, kind of how do I do that, right? So it feels very much like a puzzle and like trying to work things out and put things together. Uh, but I think the interesting thing too is like we see, like I mentioned earlier, we see Roku, we get a little montage of Roku's training in that episode. And
Mhm.
then we see him at the end of his life, kind of when he appears to Aang several times, right? In his older form. And so as a YA writer, at heart, I'm always interested in how we become who we are later in life. And so you get that starting point, you get that ending point. And so it's very interesting to me to kind of have those in place already and be able to focus really on what happened in between.
Mhm.
And I'm even really just like I'm thinking about like what in between, but I'm really thinking about what happened near the very start, right? In this little gap. Like I think, writers are always interested in those gaps, those and so when I say in between, it's like not like I'm talking about, Roku in his 40s. I'm talking about
Right.
Roku in his late teen years.
Yeah, and I think that is what's so compelling. Like I enjoy seeing Aang, I enjoy seeing Korra because we get that sort of childishness of an avatar, but we don't necessarily see their end product. So it's
Hmm.
cool to see the end product. I mean, when we first see Roku in the series, when we first see Kyoshi, like they are hardened, they are at their peak, they are at their
Hmm.
best. But before all of that, there was that Aang state, that Korra state that we didn't necessarily get to see. So this is adding some really awesome lore to an already lore-filled world full of amazing complexities. So, yeah, and you mentioned something that I want to get back to, which was sort of writing within the parameters of this universe. And I was curious because I know like when you write into IP, there are certain rules you have to follow, certain things you can't change. Were there like certainly it wasn't just like an open sandbox, go have fun. Were there certain rules you had to follow within the Avatar universe?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I had to know the world as well as possible. And so my first step was, as I was thinking about the characters, was also just diving into research. I reread all of the previous Chronicles of the Avatar book. I read all the comics over again. I read the Legends core book for the role-playing game from Magpie.
Hmm.
Um, spent a lot of time on the Avatar wiki. Rewatched the series, took notes. So a lot of just kind of research and just wanting to write and create a world that felt a little different, right? Because I'm writing, decades before Aang, and at the same time feels familiar, right? Feels consistent in not just the facts, but also the tone, right? And so really doing the research to try to nail that. But then also like in terms of the actual writing process, like because Avatar Studios has all these other projects going on, and I don't necessarily know about them. I don't know about them, except that they exist.
Sure.
And I don't even know other stuff that exists. I'm kind of like in this tiny corner, right? And so when I'm like working on the story, there are times where, Mike DiMartino was like, stay away from this topic because we're exploring it in another project. And I would be like, but that was so cool, and I wanted to like write about that. And so it's a lot more like collaborative, right? It's a lot more instead of me just off doing my own thing and working with like one editor. It's like I'm developing this story, I'm coming up with the ideas, but I'm getting a lot of feedback along the way. I'm getting feedback as I'm coming up with the story concept, getting feedback with the outline, getting feedback with the draft from Mike, from different people, from other people at Paramount or at Abrams, my editor. And so it's much more collaborative, kind of thinking
Mhm.
about, yes, trying to write within the rules of this world, but also trying to present something new, but also not trying to step on the toes or contradict anything that any of the other projects that are being worked on as
Mhm.
well. And
Uh,
again, like I'm kind of like writing into the IP, right? It's like that puzzle. It's like you work around it and you
mhm.
figure out how to make things work.
Were there any specific instances where you tried to do something and they're like, nope, you can't do that?
Yeah, I can't tell you that though,
That's
but
fine. I figured you couldn't. I was like, let's try to sneak this in here. Uh,
yeah.
I do want to go back to Roku because I just as a character because I think one of the things that makes these Avatar focused books so special is sort of establishing the dynamics of what makes this Avatar different than other avatars. Like Aang had his thing; he was in an iceberg for 100 years. Korra had this sort of impetuousness.
Mhm.
Kyoshi was misidentified, or she wasn't the Avatar at first. Someone else was thought to be the Avatar. And I really admire how Avatar Studios keeps sort of giving these new hooks to what makes this Avatar different than previous iterations. Do you feel like Roku's sort of difference is that male friendship with Sozin?
A little bit. I mean, like I think that's certainly part of it that he has this really, really close relationship with the future Fire Lord, right? Like that's a huge deal. I think connected to that is the idea that he grew up in privilege, right?
Mm,
In contrast to Kyoshi, in contrast to Aang, that he is like a super wealthy, best friends with the prince, right? Like that really impacts what somebody is like. And then I think the other piece of it that I thought about a lot too, is that he is you know, Kyoshi didn't really follow like the traditional training pattern, right?
mhm,
Aang certainly didn't follow the traditional training pattern, but Roku did. It's like you have, he's like several years studying air and then several years studying, whatever, get it, went along the path. But then I also think there's interest, you have the whole thing with him essentially blowing up the fire temple when he tries to enter the avatar state. So I think there's this interesting question of like, why does that happen, right? To somebody who has like mastered all these elements and is still struggling to do this last one or last thing. Um, and so I think those are pieces that I was thinking a lot about as I was thinking about his characters,
mhm,
yeah, what it would have been like to follow that traditional training pattern. What, why did he struggle so much with the avatar state? How was he impacted by his privilege? How was he impacted by his closeness to the Fire Nation leader, essentially, or future leader?
mhm. And I'm glad you brought that up because, obviously you get to work with characters who already exist, but you also get to create new characters in this universe, including some of his teachers. What was that like to be able to create brand new characters that fit into this universe that become a part of it? I mean, there's already wiki pages for these characters that are brand new that made their first appearance in this book. So what was the creation process like for them? Was it just like any other character?
I mean, yeah, I tried. It's yes and no. I mean, like, yeah, you're creating a character. This process is always the same, right? Of kind of like thinking about, oh, what does this character bring to the story? What are they struggling with? How do they create an interesting dynamic to the characters that already exist in the story? How do they bring something new, maybe, to the
Mhm,
universe that you haven't really seen too much of before? And so, so one of the things I knew like right away was, being like I mentioned, being Filipino, I was like, I'm gonna throw in some Filipino inspired characters and all that. And so yeah, so it was pretty cool to like have the opportunity to do that and have the opportunity to make part of my identity like part of canon. That's really exciting. It's also a lot of pressure,
mhm,
because you want to create characters that are interesting and fun that people are going to latch onto, kind of knowing how closely connected people are to these other characters that have existed in the universe. And there's also a little pressure, I think, of like in fandom, I feel like people love the traditional characters, right? They want to see Roku as much as
mhm,
possible, right? And so trying to honor that while also trying to bring in something new and find the right balance and the right amount of like, oh yeah, you get some Roku, you get some Avatar. But you're also getting this new character that I like and want to bring into the story.
mhm,
And so that's always a challenge. And so I think that's just like a lot of, kind of being conscious of that. as well as tweaking while you're editing and revising of kind of like, all right, it's been too long since we've seen Roku. Like, how do I get back to his point of view sooner?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and just kind of being aware of that dynamic. I think that's particular to IP, right?
Sure. Yeah. Um, I want to touch on another. I swear my questions aren't just how did you develop this character, but I do want to ask about one other specific one because I
Yeah.
just loved Gyatso was already such a great
Hmm.
character, and I feel like his childish self looked read so much fun. So I feel like I know the answer to this question already, but was he as much fun to write as he is to read? Because he's just a blast in the story.
Yeah. I mean, I think the he is I think also an interesting contrast to Roku, kind of
Mm,
as you read through the story. And yeah, you get him again, just like Roku. You get him in the flashback when he's young, and you get him at the end of his life, right, when he in the flashbacks with Aang. And so, well, and you also get him like as a skeleton. But anyways, and so I think it's also interesting to kind of like how do you get from point A to point Z. Um, and I also kind of approached him a little bit like what would Aang be like if Aang wasn't the Avatar,
mm,
right? If he wasn't shouldering the responsibility of being the Avatar. Like Gyatso can be that kind of goofy, a little bit carefree that Aang you see in Aang, but Aang is also pulled time and time again to his responsibilities, right? And so that's a little bit of how I view Gyatso,
mm,
and also kind of thinking about that's who he is as a character, but also why is he an interesting companion to Roku, right? Why would he be someone who who can push Roku to grow and how can Roku push him to grow? Because I think yeah, it's not enough to like just have a bunch of cool characters together. I think you have to think about their dynamics a lot and think about what they bring to the table that the other
mm.
one doesn't bring to the table, and how they're going to influence each other and push each other. And I think in terms of the Avatar gang, you always want to think about like how how do they make each other better, right?
Mm.
How do they push each other to grow?
I love that. Yeah. Before I move on from characters, are there any other characters in the Avatar universe that you are interested in writing at some point?
I mean, I would love this is, I don't know like how much I'm supposed to talk about all of this. I would love to write a young Iroh
Mm.
or the story of his son.
I've always said I want the story of Liu 10. Like I know it'll
Yeah,
break my heart, but I want to see it. So
yeah.
do
So
it.
I would love to go in that direction.
Yeah, that one would be
I don't know. I
heartbreaking.
feel like they're probably holding that story close to their
Oh,
hearts.
yeah, I'm
But
sure
yeah.
they have plans for it. All right, so let's talk about the Fire Nation because I feel like the Fire Nation is such a good it's such fertile soil to create great characters out of. And I feel like every nation could say this, but I feel like the Fire Nation in particular because it has that sort of evil overtone from the original series that these are the bad guys. But I think that's what allows for like Zuko to be one of what I think is one of the best characters out there. Um,
Mhm.
was there sort of like obviously the Fire Nation's politics and their way of doing things weighed on Roku, but what was it like to work with the politics of this sort of villainistic culture and sort of finding a middle ground to make them not as, I don't like to just use black and white terms like bad and good, but they were essentially the bad guys there. So
Mhm.
were you trying to sort of add more nuances to that sort of reputation that they had?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like I don't first and foremost like I don't believe any particular culture or people are like inherently evil or bad or inherently better than any other group of people, right?
Hmm.
And so for me that's like a starting point. And to me what happens a lot of times if look at any history is like it's ideology that spreads, right? And it's a dangerous ideology, usually a dominant ideology saying group A is better than group B, right? Or group whatever X is superior to group Y that through some set of complex factors kind of takes hold, right, as the majority opinion. And so I think that is what poisons people. That can be what poisons cultures or entire nations. And so yeah, so I spent a lot of time thinking about kind of where is the Fire Nation at this point in time, and situating it in such a way that it's not where it is, at the start of Aang's life, of course. But how can I situate it in such a place that it seems like it's on track, right? It's kind of like in the early stages of being moving in that direction. Like what would be the ideas that are taking root, that you see starting to take root? what would be the factors or the puzzle pieces that are starting to come together that are going to lead us in that direction, you know, decades down the line. And so thinking about that and also thinking about, you know, even in those cultures that we consider like moments in time that were like, you know, evil, right? We can time and time we go again to the Nazis, right? As like the epitome of what an evil culture can look like.
Mm,
Uh, you had resistance within that culture, right? You had people who disagreed with it. You had people who fought and lost their lives battling those majority opinions or majority ideologies. And so thinking about that too, and just kind of thinking about, well, what are the individual characters like within the story? And you have people certainly, sorry,
you're fine.
who you know, who kind of buy into that ideology or trying to create that ideology or trying to move in that direction. But also you have people who don't believe that, right? Who are at this point not actively resisting it too much yet because it's not there yet, right? But you kind of see in their core, even someone like Roku, right? Roku's not believing a lot of the same stuff that Sozin believes, even early in the story. So you have that those seeds, I think, earlier, and so a lot of it is about planting those seeds, I think, of kind of showing people another version, showing people kind of how it got to where it got to, right? That it wasn't just like Fire Nation evil. We're gonna go dominate everyone, but that you know there are people. They're bad leaders sometimes,
Hmm.
right? Leaders that are poisoned by those ideologies if we're better than everybody else, and then that just kind of leads to ruination for not oftentimes not just other places or nations, but sometimes even within that nation itself.
Yeah, and I should say, like from the original series, I think one of the most powerful, I think it was like a 3 episode portion where Aang and the gang go into the Fire Nation and pose as Fire Nation students.
Mhm.
And I think that does exactly what you were talking about. It sort of gave this perspective of these kids aren't bad. Like they have a dance party. It's still one of my favorite scenes.
Mhm.
And I think that did such a good job of reminding viewers, like this is not this clear-cut good versus bad situation. It's exactly what you said. There are
Mhm.
nuances there. There is bad leadership. There is all that stuff. But there are so many good people within there. So along those lines, I mean, one of the Roku has to go jump between different nations here. That's part of his training. Was your process with all them kind of the same thing of thinking, okay, he's in the Earth Kingdom now. What's the state of the Earth Kingdom at this point? And were there any? Because I feel like I want to get to the Air Nation specifically, the Air Nomads, because they're not long for this world at this point. Like
Mhm.
they are going to be destroyed very soon. So what other sort of considerations were you thinking of as he's going around the world and touching on these other places, like aside from just like, okay, what's the state that this nation is in right now, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So this was like a little bit, I don't know, it feels like cheating, but I leaned very heavily on the Legends core book
Mm.
for from Magpie because they did a wonderful job of fleshing out kind of like
Hmm.
what you know, they have these different time periods based on the different eras of the avatars. And you know, they've done this work building the worlds of kind of like what are the major things that are going on, what are the major struggles at that time period. And so yeah, so I spent a lot of time like reading and rereading the Roku section and you know the story of in the RPG takes place I think a little bit after when my story takes place. And so it's kind of like that's a starting point. And then I kind of rewind it and be like, all right, well, what happened 12, 13, 14 years before this, right?
Mm.
What are the things that led into that? And so yeah, so they have each section, they have kind of like, here's what's going on in the with the air nomads, here's what's going on with the water benders, here's what's going on with the Earth Kingdom. So yeah, so I leaned on that, read through that, and then just kind of worked backwards from there, thinking about, okay, well, I'm not going to use that event because this is occurring years after Roku becomes the Avatar. But that's a starting point to kind of show me where things were going. And so what might have happened to precipitate those types of events.
So along those lines, it sounds like you had a pretty good idea of the timeline of what your story was going to encompass. Was there anything in particular you were really looking forward to getting to within the story?
Yes, but I don't want to talk about too much detail since I feel like that
Sure.
would be spoilers. Yeah.
No,
Yeah, but
totally,
certainly there
totally.
was. Yeah.
Cool. So we're just about out of time, but I wanted to see if there was anything I haven't asked that you wanted to talk about, anything Avatar related or the process related that you were like, I wish you would have asked about that. Anything, anything hanging out there?
I don't know. I think uh if I can talk briefly about some of my favorite episodes of the
Please.
original series, yeah, I think that'll give, I think it'll people a good sense of like my vibes and kind of
Hmm.
like what I'm going into the world with.
Hmm.
And I would say a lot of them are probably pretty commonly loved by fans, but yeah, Zuko alone, Appa's Lost Days, the Raiders of the Southern Water Tribe, the yeah, I think those the Blue Spirit. I think a lot of
Ah.
these, of course, the Avatar and the Fire Lord, but I
Hmm.
really love those character-centered stories that really give us a more nuanced, more complex view of a character, and in particular that threads in like their history, their
Hmm.
past, and so we can see how that informs the present.
I'm glad you brought that up because there was one thing I will always hold true, tell people about Avatar is that I think of all the stories out there, I don't know of another ending that works as perfectly as Avatar: The Last Airbender's ending
Mhm.
does. Sort of this merging of Aang's philosophy, never bending from it, but still accomplishing what needs to be accomplished. And I always marvel at that. Like whenever I'm getting to my own endings, it's an impossible comparison because I feel like everything I watch or read
Mhm.
now, I'm like, how does this compare to Avatar's ending though? And it's just so good and so simple. But yeah, which actually factors into what we were saying earlier about the Fire Nation, about Fire Lord Ozai becoming this sort of not so great guy. But I do. So you mentioned some of your favorite episodes. Is there a favorite like pinnacle moment from the original series that you're like, that's the one that I always think about, the one that sort of I don't want to say won you over, but do you have a favorite moment from the original series or from Korra? We can include that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would go, my mind would go to the original series, and I would just say when Zuko shows up, right? It's like Zuko here,
That's
like practicing meeting them, because like kind of going back to what we were saying earlier, like it so elegantly and so beautifully and with humor encapsulates this idea of like trying to seek redemption,
hmm.
right? And how awkward it is, and how uncomfortable it is, and how much uh, you know, how much shame there is with it you have to overcome, and so much guilt you have to overcome to kind of bring yourself to that point to ask for forgiveness, right? To seek redemption. And I think that moment, it's just so silly and so goofy, right? But encapsulates that so well. Like, here's somebody we've been on this journey with for 3 seasons,
Hmm.
and here's the moment he wants to join Aang and wants to make up for his mistakes, right? And having this like really yeah, this really goofy silly moment with it, I think it perfectly encapsulates that idea. Like, here's the complexity of redemption, and paired right alongside the awkwardness of the practicality of, of seeking that
Hmm.
redemption. And I think for me, that's a moment that just really, really hits that well and makes that concept accessible. And of course, yeah, as a fan, you're rooting for Zuko by that point, and
Hmm.
you're rooting for the gang to accept him. But also, I think the story, what the story does really well is show the difficulty in accepting him, right?
Hmm.
It's not as simple as like, oh, I turned, okay, I'm a good guy, now I'm one of you, and like, welcome to the crew, right? That it is this difficult and it is this process, and I think that's what Zuko's storyline does so well.
Hmm.
In some stories, it's just like somebody flips and then they're kind of, oh, okay, I'm good now. And I think, yeah, Zuko's story for me just really encapsulates the process behind that, and they show that really well. And for me, that moment was the pinnacle of that
I
that
I com
level.
I completely agree. That's the moment. There's just so much happening there, and to make it funny is just like taking it to another level. But especially in the lead up to that, when he accidentally burns Toph's feet,
Mhm.
that part always gets me because I'm like, it was an accident. Like, don't hold
Mhm.
that against them. But again, it's part of the expert storytelling that they did there to make this like, as viewers, we're like you said, we're rooting for him. We kind of at that point know he's got to join them, but these
Mhm.
last sort of obstacles are extra difficult because we just want him to be a part of it, uh,
Mhm.
which again just plays into how good of a character he is. Somebody who hasn't come up yet, which I want to get your thoughts on, is Zuko's sister, Azula, who I still find to
Mhm.
be compelling. I'm a sucker for villains, especially when they start to show little kinks in their armor. And I think that, especially with the latest comics that was Azula centric, the graphic novel, I just find her to be such a curious character and that sort of lingering question of could she ever be good? So just sort of an open-ended question of what are your thoughts on Azula?
Yeah, I mean, I love Azula too, and I think she presents like a very interesting contrast to Zuko, right?
Mhm,
And of course, like the question of her redemption still lingers if you've read like the most recent graphic novel. And I think like watching the show, what's interesting to me is Zuko has Iroh's guidance and she doesn't, right?
mhm,
And that's really interesting. It's kind of like, well, why is Zuko so concerned with helping, or not Zuko? Why is Iroh so concerned with helping Zuko,
mhm,
but not Azula along the way? Maybe the answer is patriarchy. I don't know, but but I think that's an interesting contrast of kind of like these two people growing up in similar conditions. One has this kind of wise mentor guiding them and helping them on the right path, and you see how difficult it is for Zuko to be redeemed despite that. And then Azula, who doesn't have that, who's just kind
mhm,
of drifting off by herself. And I think you also get you get a little bit more glimpses into her past in some of the graphic novels. That I think makes it interesting too. But I think that, yeah, that question of like, is there anybody who's too far gone, is always an interesting question to me, and
mhm.
I don't have an answer, but it's one that I'm always thinking about too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that he had Iroh and she didn't. I love the part where Zuko and Iroh are in the Earth Kingdom and they're essentially about to open their own tea shop. And it's like this was like this sort of promise of a potential normality for Zuko that he's never had
Mhm.
before. And I don't think Azula ever, I know Azula never gets that chance to be normal. She never had any hope of that. So that I think that's another sort of interesting
Mhm.
contrast with what separates those two because they're so compelling. And that's why I keep saying, like, I feel like the relationships that come out of the Fire Nation are just so much more complex just because of that overarching sort of
Mhm.
the way that the Fire Nation is. Um, but then, I mean, there's so many good relationships in Avatar. I mean, I was just thinking of Toph and her parents, and like, well, that's a good one too. So
Yeah.
maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's anything Avatar that I haven't gushed about. I mean, it seems to became like a lot of Zuko, which I'm always okay with because he's the best. But any other Avatar? We didn't talk about Korra much. Anything you want to shout out about Legends of Korra? I feel like I'll ask specifically about Korra herself because I'm curious if you had a similar experience where when I first met her, I was kind of annoyed. I was like, well, like, and I think it was just because I was so used to Aang being this like model of what I felt like the Avatar should be, that her impetuousness and her impatience. But then by the end, I
Mhm.
was like, I might even like her more than Aang. I don't know. I think she's a
Mhm.
great character. So anything about Korra that really got you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I liked right away. I liked that they were doing something different
Mm,
than with Aang, right?
hmm
That you had somebody who was kind of the opposite, right? The opposite in temperament, the opposite in situation of kind of like having known from a really, really young age that she was the Avatar, having grown up with training and all the elements, right? But still kind of being stuck and not knowing air in the beginning,
hmm
right? And I think that was like a really interesting choice from the story point standpoint. I think it is interesting to have her be older than Aang, kind of have that tone shift to the series. And yeah, and I liked her right away. I think I love these like strong female characters who are impetuous and all that kind of stuff. That's always interesting to me. And so I think I just love that it was like a different story, right? Like I always respect and enjoy when we get something that's new. It wasn't just like Aang 2.0, right?
hmm
Um, I to keep my attention, like a story or a series or a continuation of a series needs to kind of do something new, have a different angle each time. And I think that's what I really love about Korra. And even like setting wise, right? I think even setting wise, it's kind of like, all right, well, the given what happens at the end of the original series, how would that actually impact things decades down the line? And I love that they wanted to explore that. Again, rather than just giving us Avatar 2.0, it's like literally thinking about the implications of this
hmm
major thing that happens at the end. And I'm like talking around it like I'm spoiling it for somebody, but you never know. Uh, and so I think that's what I really love about the Chorus series, right? Is the
hmm
chance to explore where that world would go given what Aang did.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up again because it ties back into this notion. Like every Avatar that we've seen now has sort of had that unique angle to the story, and Korra was the first one who had that difficult, no, that difficult task of you're following up Aang, who is
Hmm.
like everyone's Avatar. He's the only one we've seen grow up, and now you've got this difficult ask of you have to do something different while still being just as good. And one thing I think that the series itself did that was really intriguing was each season kind of had its own beginning, middle, and end. They were very self-contained, with obviously the big overarching story arc as well. But I feel like that also differed from the original one, where yes, there were seasons, but there was definitely a clear point A to point B target in
Yeah.
mind. Whereas Korra's it was very more grounded in the world, which was, as you said, it was
Hmm.
a great setting.
And the animation in Korra is beautiful, and the
It is.
fights, the fight scenes are amazing.
Hmm.
I don't know, do you call it choreography when it's animation? I don't know, but
I think so. Yeah.
the
Yeah, we can call it
love all, yeah.
that.
And like, as on a personal note, my son is about 4 years old now, and when he was a newborn, you're up at night feeding and everything like that. And so I ended up watching a lot of Korra like in the middle of the night while I was feeding him. And so Korra has a special like personal spot in my heart for that reason too.
I love that. Yeah. Um, Oh, I had a sort of final question, and I think I lost it. But darn it. But yeah, this was great. Parting thoughts before I go into the spiel of what's going on with Reckoning of Roku with we have a sweepstakes here at Barnes Noble. Before I talk about that, I want to see if you had parting thoughts about either Avatar or anything that we haven't talked about yet. More Zuko if you want. I don't care.
Yeah, just I don't know, just it's been an honor to be able to contribute to this world a little bit and write the story. And I hope readers enjoy it. I hope they, kind of like I was talking about earlier, I hope they see the things that they love from the original. But also I hope I've given them something new and expanded on the world in a way that keeps it interesting and keeps it novel and fresh, and breathes a little bit more life into it. Yeah. Not that it's like dead to begin with, but you know
No,
what I'm saying.
it's
Like, I'm hoping I'm bringing something new to the table as well.
yes. Well, as an unbiased reader, I can say you did. So take it from me
Thank you.
if you
Thank
want
you.
to. So real quick, The Reckoning of Roku comes out July 23rd. It's just coming up here. And at Barnes& and Noble we have a sweepstakes. You can enter the sweepstakes if you pre-order The Reckoning of Roku, and you get some amazing things. So let me make sure I get everything. You get a $100 Barnes& and Noble gift card. You get the 4-book box set of the Chronicles of Avatar series. And you get the Avatar: The Last Airbender board game, as well as a collection of Avatar figure pins, which is like all amazing stuff. And I was joking beforehand that I wonder if I could enter, but I don't think I can. But it's all good stuff. So yeah, get ready for this. It's coming out. It's great. More avatars, always good avatars. So again, Randy, thank you so much for being here today. And yeah, have fun with the book launch and all that good stuff. And
Thank
hopefully we'll
you.
we'll, we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.